Is the U.S. Secretary of Defense begging Ukraine to stop using its most effective tactic? And is Russia continuing its advance and partnering with China at an unprecedented level? And we have even more news about France ramping up its weapon production in the face of Russian aggression. This is just a lot of stories for today, and we're going to get into all of them right now. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. So the top story is, of course, the U.S. Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, and this is someone who has been very public about what he believes and the administration believes is Ukraine's almost carte blanche right to self-defense. Now, the U.S. has added some level of conditions to its aid, but those have been pretty tame in the spectrum of conditions to U.S. aid. Right? They've said, don't use U.S. weapons to attack Russian sovereign territory, which Ukraine has respected. And two, you have to follow the Geneva Convention to a T, right? That includes specifics about how Ukrainian forces treat Russian prisoners, about rules of war on the battlefield, about munitions that can and can't be deployed, even things that aren't in the Geneva Convention but reflect U.S. sensibilities, for lack of a better term, like the deployment of anti-personnel mines. Those two are things that it appears the U.S. has tried to rein in the Ukrainians a little bit. But this is really an unprecedented level of ask, I guess, from the administration, right? This is U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin saying, begging, and that's all he can do at this point, begging Ukraine to not go after Russian oil targets. And he kind of says the quiet part out loud here, right? Lloyd Austin said that Ukraine's recent drone strikes on Russian oil refineries have a, quote, knock-on effect or a follow-on effect that could affect the global energy situation. He suggested Kiev focus on, quote, tactical and operational targets instead. He said, and this is the full quote, these attacks could have a knock-on effect in terms of the global energy situation. He means oil prices. Ukraine is better served going after tactical and operational targets that can directly influence the current fight, Austin told the Senate Armed Services Committee. And while I cannot stand Tom Cotton, even a broken clock is right twice a day. And I guess that's now, because Tom Cotton says, quote, it sounds to me that the Biden administration doesn't want gas prices to go up in an election year. And I think he's right. The global energy situation is not really, especially Russian oil. Guess what? The Kiev energy situation is also in a pretty rough state thanks to Russian drone strikes. So sitting there and saying, we can't have oil prices go up is kind of nonsense. And it's even more insane when you consider the fact that another priority of the Biden administration has been addressing climate change and reducing fossil fuel use. And if you paid attention in Economics 101, you might recall that when prices go up, demand goes down. So if part of the goal is to reduce the global dependence on fossil fuels, then shellacking the oil production of a country like Russia is actually going to help the climate. So it seems a smarter, what's the word I want? I'm trying to be nice here. A more sophisticated administration with a little bit better messaging and a stronger existing connection to its voting base may sit there and be like, guess what? We are going to cheer every time Kiev destroys a Russian oil facility, because Russia and its oil production is not only contributing to an unprecedented level of global violence, but it's also contributing to climate change. But here's the thing. Cotton's right. It's an election year, and the administration has one priority, and that is making sure they win the election. And instead of trying to just explain their policymaking choices, they're literally trying to hamstring U.S. allies, infuriate climate activists as they try to fight to make oil cheaper. And at the same time, right, like this is like watching an administration. It's like watching a rowboat with like 8-year-olds. Every single person has a paddle. Not a one of them is paddling in the same direction. And it's sort of aggravating. It's more than sort of aggravating. Yeah, it is tough also because Lloyd Austin acknowledges that Russian oil production is a strategic level target, and those are generally what you want to do. Right now, obviously, tactical and operational targets are important. As we've talked about, tactical is literally like the enemies in front of you. It's the point where you and the enemy meet. Operational are things that are like 1 or 2 layers removed. These are like kind of squishy definitions, 1 or 2 layers removed. So like this would be a tactical target would be a house with a squad of Russians, right? For example, in his recent video discussed how he, and his brigade or battalion did a combined arms strike on a Russian house, right? Using drones where he was the drone pilot. That's a tactical target. An operational target would be if he said, hey, I actually found behind the lines, there's a staging area where these Russian BMPs are being fueled up or they're being staged, or that the Russian command center, right, that's coordinating this effort. That would be an operational target. And a strategic target would say, hey, we actually can get deep into occupied Ukraine, and we can disrupt like a railhead where a third of Russian supplies pass through. Oh, we can hit a command and control center where the entire operational forces. Oh, we can take out all Russian electronic warfare capabilities with a sabotage. That would be a strategic target. And in this case, the strategic target is the Russian oil production, the engine, so to speak, the economic engine that fuels the Russian war machine. So the fact is that this is just more of the kind of inability to set priorities, the inability to get things done that is endemic to the government, right? The government just operates this way because there's just so many moving parts and so many interests. But also, I think this particular administration fails to set priorities to say, what's the most important thing we do, right? And what's the second most important thing? And ultimately, inflation is such a massive concern for Americans, and I think there's truth to it. But there are lots of ways to fight inflation in the short term and in the long term. And the reality is that enabling Kiev to fight the best war it can, given that the U.S. can't support them with big checks, because that was the previous strategy, right? And that's the other problem, is that ultimately Lloyd Austin knows that this statement is not going to change Russian or Ukrainian policy one iota, because the only way it will, right, you have to have leverage. You have to have some leverage over somebody. It's like you walking up to your trash collector and being like, make sure you take my bins on a Wednesday. It's not going to happen. You can't just shake your fist, you can't just shake your fist and demand things happen a certain way. You have to have leverage. You can sit there and go, you'll pick up my trash on a Wednesday because I'm the only customer on this entire street, or I'm the head of the HOA and I can cancel your contract, right? Something like that. Without leverage, you cannot extract concessions from another party in any negotiation. And Lloyd Austin knows this. He knows that he's just trying to justify or to explain to the U.S. voting public that this rising oil prices that they're going to see is likely a function of not of the U.S.'s doing. But that's okay, right? What's interesting too, according to Bloomberg, Russia's crude oil exports by sea in the first week in April have dropped from actually a 12-month high at the end of March, mostly related to issues passing through Baltic ports. Pullback, right? Yeah. And this is probably knock-on effects from those earlier Ukrainian strikes on drone refineries, right? Of course, in a Kiev Post op-ed, one investment banker actually said Ukrainian strikes probably not driving up crude prices. Other factors were at play that ultimately drove up the prices. And the answer might lie in a much-needed overdue restructuring of the price gap, right? The crude is not refined in Russia. It will simply be exported as crude and refined elsewhere. That's not quite... It's a little more complicated. What we would see, FYI, guys, if you have these kind of supply chain effects, right, and then think of them as like a pipe or a hose, right? And let's say I pinch off a part of the hose. This is the part where Russia extracts crude oil. Maybe that's what they're going for. I think they actually went after refineries. But like, let's say a first phase of refining. That's where you pinch them off. You cut off Russia's ability. You're going to have a glut. You're going to have a buildup earlier in the pipeline. So what you're going to see is that pre-refined crude is going to have an oversupply because it can't make it through the refineries. That is going to actually, the price is going to get lower, but because you've damaged the refineries, it's going to be a trickle out the other side, and that price is going to rise. So you're going to say, oh, it's actually, Ukrainian strikes on refineries have actually reduced crude prices. That's expected. And you should see refined products rise. And wherever you pinch in the pipeline, so to speak, that is where you're going to see a glut and a shortage and a glut, right? A shortage before, or a shortage after, and a glut before. Just, in case you have to deal with your, go on your family vacation and somebody wants to give you some brain dead talking point. Now you can explain to them the dynamics at work here. Speaking of dynamics, there seems to be a changing dynamic between the Russian and Chinese governments. Now, I've talked about this a long time, and for context, the Russian state and the Chinese state are not equals, right? Let's see if we can find it. The Russian GDP, not GDP per capita, and then we got to find the China GDP. So this is important. The gross domestic product of China is 18 trillion USD. That's in 2020, right? And that's low for China, right? The GDP of Russia is $2 trillion. So for context, India is about 50% higher at 3 trillion. Germany, 4 trillion. So I say that because these are not equal, right? This is the equivalent. If 2 trillion is $30,000, then China makes about $300,000 a year. So that's the idea, is that this is like saying that someone who makes 30 grand a year and $300,000 a year are like equal partners in an economic venture, right? Imagine imagine, for example, if your spouse, you made $300,000 a year and your spouse made $30,000 a year, and you'd go, well, whose job should who contributes more money into the relationship? You go, I don't know. Yeah, you do. And so that context is important when you hear Russia say these things. So Russian state media highlighted Russia and China's joint effort to combat what they call Western dual containment, targeting Russia and China. The Kremlin newswire TASS reported that the Chinese ambassador Wang suggested that Russia and China engage in what they call dual counteraction in response to alleged Western attempts at dual containment. Containment is a reference to a Cold War policy in which basically Russia and China were encircled by U.S. bases and strong allies in order to sort of block Chinese expansion and Russian expansion into different regions. NATO is explicitly founded as a containment operation during the Cold War. Again, during that era, countries like Poland and Hungary were also part of a USSR alliance. So it was just a different time with a different map of Europe. But what's fascinating is that Lavrov has claimed that Russia and China now have a, quote, comprehensive partnership and strategic interaction that has reached what he calls an unprecedented level. He said that they have mutual national interests and coordinate to solve internal and external problems. Now, here's the thing. Lavrov also claimed that these relations extend, quote, beyond a military political alliance, the Cold War, and that both countries are working to create a, quote, multipolar world order through multilateral formats like the BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now, Russia, given the fact that Russia is currently in a stalemated regional war on its immediate border, it is really hard to argue that Russia is contending for a multipolar world. Again, when you look at the size of these economies, right? You look at China's, you look at Russia's, And then let's get the U.S. GDP, 25 trillion in 2022. And you could see here again a what's that? 25% higher than China's, and China in turn, the third largest economy, Japan, with just 4 trillion. I point this out because there are clearly, like, we are moving towards a multipolar world. Two huge economic titans in the US and China. If you roll up all of the EU together, you have potentially a third pole, right? The EU's GDP totals about the same as the United States. Well, actually, sorry, 19 trillion. So there is a multipolar world. There is an argument for a multipolar world. The problem is, you know who's not in this multipolar world? China, or excuse me, Russia. Russia is like, imagine you had Michael Jordan, LeBron James, and the captain of your local JV basketball team. And they're like, look at these 3 basketball players here. We're 3 great basketball players. And like, it's kind of true. And this is when Russia's like, guys, China and us, we're going to build a multipolar world. That's like saying, me and LeBron, we're going to kick your ass at pickup basketball. It's like, no, LeBron's going to kick your ass and you're going to stand there like this, right? So that's what Russia is trying to do here. Pretend all of those comments are coming from the middle school basketball player standing next to LeBron, who's like, me and LeBron we're deep allies. We're really working together to create a whole other team in this pickup basketball court, a whole other, we're not, the old duo, they're not going to be the dominant team. It's going to be me and LeBron, right? That's what this is. That's what all of this is. Now, does that mean that they're not true? That Russia and China aren't deepening their cooperation? It seems like they definitely are. As we've talked about earlier, China seems willing to actually have their intelligence services actually do some analysis, collect some, share satellite information with Russia. So China is firmly orienting itself into this Russian camp. And Russia wants that to happen. They want to make China more pro-Russian so that, because what they want is for China to say, hey, we already are a little bit pro-Russian. We're already a little bit in conflict with the West. And the West is mad at us for being so pro-Russian. So they're like, well, if they're already mad at us for being pro-Russian, we might as well be super pro-Russian. That's Russia's goal, is to create this perception that China is really, really a strong Russian partner, so that China is like, well, we're already facing all the consequences of partnering deeply with Russia, so we might as well just do it. That said, Russia has things China wants. Russia makes a lot of fertilizer. They make a lot of liquid natural gas. They make a lot of refined and unrefined crude oil and fossil fuels, and a lot of things that China really, really, really needs. It relies on a lot of imports to achieve its industrialization goals. That said, words are pretty cheap for Russia and China, both of them. Just, they talk out their ass all the time. Actions are what matter. And we'll see. Again, to me, the action of China increasingly helping Russia's defense industrial base, providing Russia with geospatial intelligence. Those are real actions. Those I worry about. I worry less about these kind of preposterous over-the-top statements, guys. But if you're looking for some over-the-top energy, you want to check out Strike Gum. Strike Gum. It is 90 milligrams of caffeine in every piece, as much as a Red Bull, as much as an Amp Energy. Plus 100 milligrams of alpha GPC, right? So if you need that pick-me-up, you don't have to go to a gas station, drop $4.50 on a Red Bull, right? You just keep this in your glove box, keep it in your car, keep it in your toolbox, and you pop a piece and you're good to go. You want to check it out, obviously, on strikegum.com. This is where we have our new customer discounts, our military and first responder discounts, and we're always doing new sales. But we also are now on Amazon, right? So you can go to amazon.com and you can search for Strike Gum Energy, and you're going to see the trays. You're going to see the, let me make sure I can pull this up here. Okay. There you go. Yeah, you're going to pull up the trays. You're going to see this. And thanks to the dozens of people who've left us 5-star reviews, you guys know that on Amazon, 5-star reviews are everything. And we really appreciate you guys. If you've purchased it and you feel you've had a 5-star experience, man, let us know. Let us know. Leave us a review. Okay. There's more stories, guys. We're not even done. That's how crazy this news cycle has been. France is saying, listen, we're doubling down on weapons to Ukraine. And the top French official has officially said, Russia leaves us no choice but to build up our military. And it's true. I've talked about this for a long time, that Europe needs to be more active in its own defense, right? If it wants to live in a multipolar world, if it wants to have agency as the EU, it absolutely can. And the fact that a country that is economically as large as the United States, a bloc that is as large as the United States, has a defense sector that cannot fight a small regional war, and it doesn't even have to fight it. It just has to equip it, is pretty embarrassing. And France is finally getting back to its long-standing policy of saying, listen, we are our own country. We're a large economy. We have a very professional military that is very capable as it stands. And we have a responsibility to keep ourselves safe and secure. And it's tough to, I don't have an argument with it, right? Sometimes having an independent country, they can do things and intervene in places and ways that you cannot wait for the U.S. or NATO, right? And we saw that in the French intervention in Mali, right? While the U.S. certainly backed France up, this was a French operation, a French-led effort. And it's only possible because France invests in its military. Now, this is coming to us from the French Minister of Defense, Le Cornu, who admitted that his government intends to overhaul France's military production, increase its capacity and output, and that help the Ukrainian military receive some of the output of that increase. But again, just being able to manufacture your own military equipment is a net good, right? And Le Cornu admits Russian aggression in Europe has forced France to take steps to rearm and improve its ability to protect itself from a conventional military threat, right? For 2 decades, the only real meaningful threat was a terror one, right? In which case, countries invested heavily into their counterterrorism forces, special forces, special police, that sort of thing. And this idea of a conventional military threat, right? One that that can't be countered with really sophisticated intelligence gathering and really high level elite troops, right? That relies on just a really well organized military with really, really good logistics. And committing resources to arm Ukraine is a key piece of the strategy, the defense minister said. And that makes sense, right? Because the Ukraine is doing the part where you have to actually have your citizens pull triggers, right? And actually, but if you are someone like France, you sit there and go, listen, we can build our country to fight. We can build our defense industrial base to fight a modern war by helping Ukraine fight this modern war. So we do the part where we manufacture, where we forecast, where we equip, where we identify battlefield needs and then produce them. And then we transfer them to Ukraine where their military employs them. It's a really, really sophisticated strategy to create a defense industry that is ready and equipped to fight a modern war. Because if you've read any history of Korea, the Korean War, famously, the U.S. had a large military, but it did not have a modern one, right? The initial forces that were fighting in Korea were equipped with World War II era weapons, which weren't able to stand up to tanks that had evolved over a decade. They had an organization that reflected, again, a very World War II mentality when there had been a lot of changes, and the U.S. wasn't really able to. One of the reasons the U.S. got pushed back so badly early in the Korean War is because they were basically trying to fight a 1950s conflict with a 1940s military. And you have to, as a military, you don't always get a brilliant general like MacArthur to come in and save the day, right? As the U.S. had. You have to invest in building a modern military to fight the war that's coming, not the war you just came from. And for the West, we've invested a lot in building a military that can fight a counterinsurgency, but that is not the fight in the future. You've got to invest in fighting a real modern war. And that's what France is doing. So the final thing I wanted to talk about is that we've actually seen Russia make a number of advances across the front line. One in Pervomaisky. You can see the town of Pervomaisky. This is south of Avdiivka. You can see here with, Russian forces advancing, taking the town with Ukrainian forces withdrawing to this town of Netalova, as well as some advances near Umansky. But as we've talked about, again, Ukraine really looking hard at this river and canal system here, or canal and reservoir system, and using this as kind of their ultimate defensive line. And while Russia is making advances, they're generally, except for Pervomaisky, they're generally advancing into these open fields here, which is not really something that's worth worrying a ton about. You can also see Russian forces making some advances north of Stepova. This is this is on the northern end of Avdiivka, but again, just advancing into a windbreak, not really anything to be like alarmed or noteworthy. But there's a lot of active fighting in Vimivka, Krasnoarivka, Vodiane, Robdina. So a lot of very, very, to me, troubling signs of the state of the Ukrainian military that really is counting on U.S. aid and continually being let down by the United States, who, again, still somehow has the gall to tell them what targets they can and can't hit. Anyway, guys, that is all I had for you. A huge thank you to the Colonel tier members at combatvetnews.com. A huge thank you to our Lieutenant tier members. I could not do this without you guys. I appreciate you so much, and I will see all you guys in the next one. Cheers.